Every week, Hillsdale College President Larry Arnn joins Hugh Hewitt to discuss great books, great men, and great ideas. This is Hillsdale Dialogues, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio.
Morning glory and evening grace, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt, joined by Dr. Larry Arnn, president of Hillsdale College. All things Hillsdale are collected at HughForHillsdale.com. The Hillsdale Dialogues, all things Hillsdale at Hillsdale.edu. This is week 2 of our walk through Winston Churchill's great memoir, written in 1930, called My Early Life. He was 54 at the time. World War I was behind him. A lot was behind him. A lot was ahead of him, of course. But I want to go back, Dr. Arnn, I missed last week, setting up the Battle of Majuba Hill. And the Battle of Majuba Hill is referred to again and again because Lord Salisbury, who we did talk about last week, who's mentioned again and again in My Early Life, is depicted by Winston Churchill as keeping his table clear to settle accounts with the Khalifa and with Majuba's victors in the First Boer War. So let's talk a little bit about the First Boer War and a little bit about Khalifa, although we covered the River War already. Let's go back and set the table for the Steelers fans who forgot, or the people who listen in the morning and have now just come to us in the afternoon.
So Churchill fought in Cuba, and then he went off to India, and he went up and fought on the Afghan border, and then he went back to England, and then he went down to Sudan, wormed his way in there. And that's where they fought the Mahdi of Allah. And then his last war before he went into Parliament was he went down and fought in South Africa. So there's 4 wars. And he would eventually fight in the First World War to make a 5th. And so, yeah, the South African War was a mess. And it did not go well. And Churchill could see that.
Well, there are two, the First Boer War and then the second. The First Boer War, the Brits get run out. I'd never read about Majuba Hill of 1881, where the Boers just killed everybody and took 100, and it was a stain on the British Empire because the Brits didn't lose, much less to a young 19-year-old farm boy.
Yeah, well, their rule, from something like, from the American Revolution until now, actually, is the British always managed to win the last battle.
Yeah.
And so they got, the Boers and the British. The Boers have been in South Africa at that time. They'd been in for 300 years. And the British had been there for a very long time. And they had gotten on. And, the story of the British Empire is that it got formalized over time. It wasn't a plan exactly, but the British were going out all over the world and they were making settlements, and the British East India Company was making settlements. That's how they got India. And so South Africa developed like that too. And Cecil Rhodes was a very important figure late 19th century because he wanted to formalize all that stuff and had something to do with tensions rising between the Boers, the Dutch settlers to South Africa, and the British. And they had a fight. And that left a wound on the British, which broke out again in 1900. Is that the year?
I think it's around there. The Jameson Raiders are a little bit before, but we'll come back to that next segment.
1898. And so Churchill is involved in the Second War. And when the Second War started, Churchill was a journalist. He would eventually join up again to the South African Light Horse. Did you mention that in your list? Because he was a member of that.
No, I listed the British Army. Yeah.
Yeah. And, that was a unit of the British Army.
I did not mention that. South African Light Horse. Yeah, I mentioned that last week.
Yeah. Yeah, and he was... he goes down there, and they're fighting the Boers again, and the Boers are very tough. And they fight guerrilla tactics. They called it that. And they have a big land. It's sort of like the American Revolution, except our land is more varied and bigger. And they live on the land, and they're very hard to corral, and they're mobile. They fight from horseback a lot. And
he calls them the greatest horseback fighters ever, that they can shoot and ride. And I'm thinking the Comanches, that book you told me to read.
Yeah. I was going to say.
I'm thinking that the Boers and the Comanches would have been paired off pretty well.
Yeah, that's right. It was, and the British had a terrible time with them and beat them finally. But the war, so, the most vivid war story about Churchill, my favorite, is early-ish in the South African War, not long after he gets there. He's down there to be a journalist. And remember, Churchill is making princely sums for the time. And his articles are about all of these wars, except he couldn't write about Cuba. They're very widely read. He's probably the most popular author, and then all his early books about these wars are bestsellers. And he's just a kid, and he's opining about strategy and generals and the rights and wrongs of the war. And from a distance, sort of, he's on the British side, but he recognizes merit in the Boers. And so he's down there, and he's got a reputation. And there's a man named Haldane who knows his reputation, has seen him fight, and likes him, and says, "Come on this train. We're going to get on an armored train and go out to a station and scout. And then the tracks only go one way, and there's no way to turn the train around. So then we're going to back up all the way back." And Churchill has been on the armored train before, and he doesn't like it very much and doesn't think it's even a very good idea. And, because it's vulnerable, right? You do know where it's going to go. And in this case, both directions. And so they go out and get to this place where they're going, and they stop, and then they get back on the train, and they're coming back. And they go into a little valley with some rocky hills on either side. And the Boers have some light artillery and rifles, a lot of them. And they're up in the hills behind the rocks, and they pile rocks up on the track, and they shoot at the train. And then the engineer gets going really fast and backs into a pile of rocks and derails some of the cars at the back. And so now they're stuck. And eventually they would lose about 13 people to death and I think 60 casualties. And they're in fire from above, from protected positions, and they're behind in this metal train, but they don't have anywhere to go. And Churchill, darn if he doesn't get out of the thing and walk around and look. He records that in this book, he records that it was like being in front of an iron target in a target range, people shooting at him. And he walks around and looks and he studies the situation. He comes back and he opens the door and he says, "We can get this thing loose. Come with me." And so he conscripts a bunch of them. Some of them were killed. And they go to work to, mostly they use the engine. The engineer is a civilian, is wounded. And Churchill says to him, "Buck up, man. In war, no one is ever wounded twice in the same battle. And you are going to get a medal." So the engineer didn't run away.
I haven't gotten that chapter yet. We'll have to retell that story down the road. I do want to.
Oh, so we're not there yet. Okay.
We're not there yet, but we'll tell that story at length.
This is the best war story in the book.
Okay, we will come. That will be in, I think, week 4. Let's go back at this point and talk about the Jameson Raiders. It's on page 98 of my edition, which is the William Manchester prefaced edition. Now, I did not read the Manchester foreword because of the advice of your colleague, Dr. O'Toole, in Alan Bloom's translation of the Republic. He said, read the foreword last in a book, always, so you can make your own impression. I think that's very good advice. I didn't read the Manchester thing, so I'm in chapter 8. It's chapter 7. It's called Hounslow, Hounslaw. And
okay,
dinner, he's been invited to dinner by his mother, Jenny. She's not there. She's late. And invited, it's not Churchill's fault, John Morley, who is a very senior member of Parliament, and Sir John Willoughby, who is on bail awaiting trial for his part in the Jameson raid. So we have to explain Cecil Rhodes, the Jameson raid, and why that wouldn't be a good idea to invite John Morley and Sir John Willoughby to the same dinner, and how Churchill gets through that. Dr. Arnn, do you remember it?
Yeah, well, so Morley is a great man. Churchill wrote a lovely essay about him in Great Contemporaries, and he was what they called in the Liberal Party a Little Englander. He eventually resigned from the cabinet on the outbreak of the First World War because he supported the war, but he didn't want to be part of it, and he'd worked like a man for 4 years to avoid the outbreak of the war, trying to find a way to get along with Germany.
But it stopped right there. I'll be right back. The Hillsdale Dialogue continues. All things Hillsdale at hillsdale.edu. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Come right back.
Hillsdale College is a small, Christian, classical liberal arts college that operates independently of government funding, and we want you or your son or daughter to apply. At Hillsdale, students grow in heart and mind by studying timeless truths in a supportive community dedicated to the highest things. Hillsdale College costs significantly less than other nationally ranked private liberal arts colleges and receives regular recognition as a best value, and nearly all students receive financial aid. Our robust core curriculum, vibrant student life, and 8-to-1 student-to-faculty ratio make for an education like no other. For more information or to fill out an application, visit hillsdale.edu/info. That's hillsdale.edu/info.
Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt with Dr. Larry Arnn, all things Hillsdale at hillsdale.edu. You were saying, Dr. Arnn?
Cecil Rhodes was a tremendous human being, by the way. And he's out there, building the British Empire. And, a lot of charity for the people who lived in the, mostly in undeveloped countries, for the people who lived in those places. He meant well by them. But he wanted Britain to grow and civilize the world. And so they get down there and they conduct a raid to, and it gets them in deep water with the Boers. Now, I'm forgetting what happened.
Well, the Jameson people got caught. Some of them got killed. And those that didn't get killed, Cecil Rhodes disowns them, even though he's probably behind it. And they're trying to go back and take over the gold area because they discovered gold after the First Boer War. And all of a sudden, Cecil Rhodes wants the gold, as does Britain. So the Jameson raiders trot in, I think it's to present-day Rhodesia, or present-day Zimbabwe, which had become Rhodesia after it was South Africa and after it was the Boer Empire. And they get slaughtered. These cavalrymen don't do anything. The Boers know they're coming. They shoot them up. And the Brits get their own people back, including Sir John Willoughby. So Sir John Willoughby is arrested. They all go to jail for 2 years, by the way. They've killed a bunch of people. They've invaded a country. They started a war. But they got 2 years. But Sir John Willoughby gets invited to dinner. And then Churchill, his mom's not there, Lady Jenny, and Morley walks in, and the line which stuck with me, which I wrote down, but blood had been shed, and that makes a different tale. He's talking about you can get along with anyone in the aristocracy unless one of them's charged with murder, in which case you can't be nice to him.
Let's see, the government, that's right. So I thank you for helping. I've forgotten. The government disavowed this raid and knew nothing of it. And a lot of things happened like that in the empire. Lord Clive was not, who, more or less conquered India for Queen Victoria. He was not sent to do that. He was not even a military man. Just there was a lot of strife, and he ended up being good at war and diplomacy. And so Jameson is following in those footsteps, right? And Jameson was in the employ of Cecil Rhodes, and he had 700 horsemen. And so they marched to try to take a place in South Africa that was of strategic importance, and they got completely routed and all of them captured. And so that's a sensation, right, all over the empire. And so here's young Winston Churchill at dinner with John Morley, very important man, very greatly respected, who would hate this kind of thing, and one of the guys on trial. Convicted, I guess.
Do you remember? They would not address each other for the entire dinner. So it's a very small table, and they would not talk to. I mean, it's a weird society from which Churchill emerges. We are repeatedly reminded in my early life that pre-World War I Britain is different from post-World War I Britain in many insignificant ways.
Yeah, well, manners, they have different manners than us. And I always say about my wife, different and more. And so it's really, because the British would be very good at chopping each other up politely if that's what they wanted to do. But John Morley was a particularly, what do you call it, upright guy with a kind of, he was ascetic. And so one could see him sitting there in disapproval.
You remind me of a story you've told before, but again, it was in the morning. So I'd like you to retell it in the afternoon. Why you didn't like the Queen or the Crown, because it shows Margaret Thatcher at Balmoral not being comfortable. And you, of course, dispute that completely.
Yeah, also Churchill. It shows Churchill and the Queen arguing in ways that there's no record of them arguing. And the truth is, Churchill and the Queen adored each other. And the record of that is very rich. And, Churchill presided over, he was prime minister, over her coronation and organized that. And she put his plaque in, tried to make him a duke and put his plaque in Westminster Abbey. So, yeah, that's not.
And they tried to make Margaret Thatcher look like a middle-class hick and that the royals treated her poorly. But in fact, I think you've said to me before, they never treated anyone poorly, and they knew how to deal with everyone because they'd been doing it for hundreds of years.
Yeah, that's right. They couldn't. That's just not how that works. And so that about that thing, I don't. I never liked that series, and I noticed. I'm a trial to my wife.
I know that.
But if it's something about something I know a lot about, and I don't like it, it's hard for me to be courteous. And so I complained of it, and she decided not to watch it. And I felt bad about that. And I said, well, you should watch it. I'll sit through it. She said, no, I'm not going to make you do that. But she did try to watch it when I was on the road, when I was away, and she turned against it too.
Oh.
She, yeah, it's pretty bad. And it's, not the proper respect. Now, here's the thing about Churchill to understand. Churchill was very courteous to women, and he was, what would you call it? He was not risque. He was not discourteous, except in the parliamentary way, to important people. He conducted himself with, like, if you were talking to Winston Churchill and he mentioned your wife, he would say, and you remember you have presented your wife to me. So Churchill is very capable of being unpunctual, and he's very capable of arguing with anybody. But if it's a person to be respected, he would argue with them with respect.
Can I add, though, about women? He is occasionally quite abrupt with his secretarial staff because he's got a war to run. Is that fair?
Yeah, but they loved him. And there's this famous, the last one, Jane Portal died lately, and I knew her. And they all, and even before he became the greatest man in the world, they just adored him. And there's a story once that Elizabeth Leighton, I think it was, he was in a hurry, and he barked a little, and she cried, and he touched her hand and said, "Don't mind me. We're all toads under the harrow." So there's another time one of the ladies, Churchill's house was kind of like a zoo, pigs all over the place outside, birds inside. He had a budgerigger, and he would let the budgerigger out, and he'd fly around the room when he was doing his dictation. And in bed, he'd start his morning dictation in bed and had breakfast in bed. And this darn bird landed on the woman's thing and started picking at her hair clips, and her hair started falling. And she's trying to take dictation, and she's messing with the thing. And he said, he said, looked at her and said, "Don't mess with it." So he was distracted. He didn't like that. The bird didn't distract him. She did.
Don't go anywhere except to hillsdale.edu or Hugh for Hillsdale.com. I'll be right back with Dr. Arnn on The Hugh Hewitt Show. Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. The Hillsdale Dialogue is underway. Hugh for Hillsdale.com for all prior dialogues. We're talking about Winston Churchill's My Early Life. That's the book you ought to be reading. Let me move on to The Slow Boat to India. Before that, in fact, I want to mention, at the same time we're reading My Early Life, I'm listening to Masters and Commanders, Andrew Roberts' version of the relationship between FDR and Marshall and Churchill and Lord Allenbrook. And an aside in that book is how Churchill and Marshall got along. Winston Churchill and George Marshall were very respectful of each other, even though FDR wasn't respectful of Marshall and Churchill wasn't respectful of Allenbrook. It's kind of an interesting deal.
Well, that story is, the Allenbrook. So I will tell you about Martin Gilbert's view of Allenbrook. Arthur Bryant, Allenbrook kept a diary. It was illegal to keep a diary. Some of the most important evidence we have is from people who illegally kept
Many of them kept illegal diaries.
Oh, yeah, they did. And so Arthur Bryant, a historian, edited Allenbrook's diary, and Martin Gilbert always believed that he exaggerated the conflict. The conflict was there. I mean, first of all, they're fighting for their lives in a desperate war, and they're working all the time. And these are very strong people, or they couldn't have won that war. So, of course, they argued. But, and then Allenbrook had a big reason to be disappointed. Britain held out, and they paid a heavier cost in percentage of their capacity to win the war. But then and on D-Day, and for at least 6 weeks after, there were more British and Imperial soldiers at D-Day than there were American. And Allenbrook had been the first British officer from the beginning of the war, from Churchill's taking over. And he didn't get the gig that Dwight Eisenhower got. And that was because of the potential of America, not because of what had been done so far.
That's a good reminder.
Things didn't work out as they might have for Allenbrook. Or for Britain.
We'll come back to him, because I think we may end up doing the 6 volumes on World War II just because our country is becoming illiterate about everything. I want to talk to you about the longboat to China and the advantages of long, slow travel. I just finished listening to Brideshead Revisited, read by Jeremy Irons, and there's a very long sea voyage in that. There's a longer sea voyage for Winston Churchill when he first goes to India. There are advantages to taking 23 days to get somewhere, are there not?
Yeah, well, if you're, there's a photograph, is the Queen Mary still in Long Beach Harbor?
I don't think so. Yes, it is. Yes, it
is. In the stateroom where Churchill stayed, if you go in there, there's a photograph of him in that room. And there are boxes everywhere, metal rectangular boxes. And he would take 20 boxes of work and some staff. This is later in his life. When he was young, he would take books and paper, and he would write on those things. And he was an immensely productive man all his life. And it accelerated until he was 80 years old. And the long voyages were thinking times. And India, Churchill was bored in India. You said China, but you're talking about him being on.
I said India, yeah. Going to Bombay.
And Churchill was bored in India. It was fun. He loved to play polo. If you were a British officer in India, you had a servant, and it was a life of ease. And it drove Churchill batty. And so he was relieved by 3 things. One was every chance he got, he went off and joined a fight somewhere. And, he was in the southern half of India at Bangalore, but the fights were all up on the northern frontier. So he went up there twice. But that's one thing. Polo was another thing. And his polo team won the All India Polo Championship.
I have to pause right there. Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt with Dr. Larry Arnn, president of Hillsdale College. All things Hillsdale at hillsdale.edu. Just go check out the website or go to hugh4hillsdale.com. You'll find lots of serious conversations with a lot of serious people. And now, the quote here, he said, "We attended the serious purposes in life." This was expressed in one word, polo. So.
Yeah. But, and then the other thing was, do you want to talk about this yet?
Nope.
He decided to learn.
Not yet. That's
India.
next week. I'll come back to it.
Okay.
I'll come back to it. First, I want to talk about the life in India when he arrives in Bombay. So let's first talk about Colonel Brabazon, who doesn't go with him to India, but is in charge of the 4th Hussars. And when that's his first unit. And Churchill trains under this colonel. He's grown up with this colonel. This colonel is a friend of the family. And this colonel gives them, he can't say the word R, and so he gives them a farewell address. And Churchill says, that famous appendage of the British Crown, India. And so the British Crown, it's kind of a endearing quality that Churchill will remember people in his life as they are, not as perhaps they want to be remembered.
Well, these are, Brabazon and Redvers Buller, and there are 4 or 5 people who were very important commanders to Churchill, in part because he found them inspiring, and in part because they let him do what he wanted to. And, they're the offset against Lord Kitchener, who, Churchill had little but friction with for most of his life. And remember, this is Churchill. I work with, 18 to 21 year olds, right? So Churchill is by now 24, right? And he's learning everything important thing he does, he's doing for the first time. And so meeting a guy like that, having an influence on his career, leading men, he's watching that for the first time. And it made an impression on him.
When he describes living in India, he says, every cavalry subaltern, again, Steelers fans, that means second lieutenant, gets a butler, a dressing boy, and a groom, which, quote, form the foundation of the cavalry subaltern's household. Princes could live no better than we. It's really an extraordinary life to be a colonial in India in the late 1800s. It's extraordinary.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's always been interesting to me about that why Churchill was impatient in India. He writes, it's in the book, I was sick of India, right? But a person could go out there and live a long life and have plenty and ease and authority and not necessarily that much work to do. India was, for most of the British time, was very pacific, right? It worked. There weren't that many British people there. Indians ran India under ultimate British direction. And, the poverty there was such that an excellent living to an Indian, a good living to an Indian was not costly at all to a poor subaltern. That life.
I had a question for you. Would word of his arrival have gone in advance? Because he's invited, the ship docks in Bombay, he's invited by the Lord High Governor of whatever to come to dinner, and he has a wonderful dinner. And he says, on the whole, after 48 hours of intensive study, I formed a highly favorable opinion of India. Would they have known that Lord Randolph Churchill's son was coming? And even though Lord Randolph Churchill had gone on the outs, I don't know if he had died yet. I think he had died. But nevertheless, he was from a great family, and his uncle was the Duke of Marlborough. Yeah,
of course. But the other thing is, though, that would be, a name on a list of such people. You have to remember that Winston Churchill didn't really become Winston Churchill until 1940. And so he was a connected guy, an important guy, had a little bit of a reputation of his own by now. And so he'd be on a list that would get invited. But on the other hand, he was not a soldier. But Churchill had a very close friend in Parliament named Hugh Cecil, who was one of the Salisburys. And they are rich, and they are, really important, more important than the Duke of Marlborough. And so the point is, if he showed up, that'd be a different thing, right? And you got to remember about the aristocracy that there are levels in it, and there are levels of money too. Like I've been enjoying, because I bought my Cybertruck and because Elon Musk is helping to save the world right now, I've been enjoying learning about these tech gazillionaires who, in my opinion, have figured out a lot about the world that's really interesting and good. The guy named Andreessen, who can quote the Federalist Papers.
Mark,
well. Yeah, and I'm going to meet that guy. He doesn't know it, and I know it. And I'm going to be like Winston Churchill. I'm going to go meet him. And these guys, these guys are all, they're gazillionaires, right? But they think that Elon Musk is really rich. and so.
Talking about wealth, Churchill includes in this chapter, because they got to buy polo horses, and they don't have any money. So they borrow money from the local Indian bankers. And Churchill writes, direct quote, "They only charged italics 2% period, italics lowercase a month period." Now he uses those italics and he uses bad capitalization he knew it was to be written, not to be read. And he knew they only charged 2% italics period a month period. So he's giving a lesson there that it's hard to miss. It's funny, but I don't know if anyone's going to get it. The book is great. My Early Life will continue for, I think, 5 more weeks on this, so go out and get it.
It's no secret that Americans are more divided than ever. And it's not just over what policies will improve our great country. No, it's over whether America is great at all, whether America deserves our love. That's why Imprimis is so important. Imprimis looks at the issues of the day from a constitutional perspective, reminding citizens always of our great heritage of liberty. For more than 50 years, Imprimis has featured speeches from the smartest conservative thinkers and writers at Hillsdale events. These days, Hillsdale publishes people like Molly Hemingway, Andy Puzder, Harmeet Dillon, and Chris Rufo. Over 6.4 million American households and businesses receive Imprimis absolutely free. And I urge you to sign up for it today at no charge. To get your free lifetime subscription, go to hillsdale.edu/lifetime right now.
Welcome back, America. Hillsdale Dialogue underway, and they're all collected at HughForHillsdale.com. We're reading My Early Life by Winston Churchill. There's a lot to cover in it, Dr. Arnn.
Well, Churchill was, financially embarrassed at various points in his life. Always a really good earner, but see, his character is emerging here, by the way, because he is not fit to settle into a life of ease and authority.
Yes.
He's impatient. He's impatient with that, right? Here's a story from the writing of the Churchill biography. There's a letter in the Churchill archive. We have published it. And it's from an Indian barber who's writing to the great man, Winston Churchill, decades later. And he writes, "I can remember when I used to put the eau de cologne water on your face." And so it falls to me to figure out what eau de cologne water might be. And it's one of my many failures. Because sometimes, the most terrible thing was if I would be given an assignment to find something, and I did sometimes find remarkable things, but then Martin Gilbert would find it after I'd worked on it for a long time. So I never found eau de cologne water. Martin Gilbert had a realization, eau de cologne. That's what that was.
All right, let me close this way. It's back on luck, right? Let me counsel my younger readers to beware of dislocated shoulders, because he dislocates his shoulder upon arriving in India, and people can read about that. But, he says, at the Battle of Omdurman, he couldn't use his sword, so he had to use his Mauser pistol. Life is a whole, and luck is a whole, and no part of them can be separated from the rest. That's on page 102 of my edition. It's the second time he's come around to luck. Dr. Arnn. And he's right, because we've read the River War with the audience, and he couldn't wield a sword because his shoulder would always pop out. But he used a pistol, and he survived the last charge of the British cavalry.
Yeah. Well, he tells that in a charming way. He tells about that, right? He says that if your reins are cut or your horse is bleeding or you stumble, everybody rushes up to kill you. But what was happening with Churchill was people would come up to him and he'd shoot him in the face.
Yes.
And sure enough, people stopped coming. And, and so that's right. It's just like, and Churchill had a high threshold for pain, right? He played a lot of polo in great pain and with zeal and vigor and didn't regret it. And so the point is that thing, Aristotle writes, by the way, that the English expression is that fortune favors the bold. What Aristotle writes is people with a lot of purposes have more luck than people who have few. And so I think that's how Churchill regards it.
Well, this is a grand book. We will return to it next week, and we'll be up, and we're going to get to the part that Dr. Arnn likes when he goes up to Bangalore and starts to read. So do not miss this. This is a grand book, by the way, Dr. Arnn. Thank you for saying we should come here for. I've never read this before. Go get My Early Life. We got 5 more weeks of My Early Life. Don't miss any of it. All Hillsdale Dialogues at hillsdale.edu or Hugh for Hillsdale.com. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Harley. Thank you, Dwayne. Talk to you Monday on the next Hugh Hewitt Show.
Thanks for listening to the Hillsdale Dialogues, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio. For more information about Hillsdale College, head to hillsdale.edu.